That's the opening riff to the song Blackest Eyes off the album In Absentia by Porcupine Tree. Came out in about 2002, Lava Atlantic Records. And that song, that riff, kind of opened the door to the next 10 years of my life. I had been playing in a band with a Scottish artist named Fish for a very long time. And in that time period, I had met a guy named Steve Wilson, who was in a band called Porcupine Tree. And I was a big fan of Porcupine Tree. I'd met him briefly in 1995. And he had come up to a party at Fish's farm, and the band had played. And at that time, I was rocking this guitar, two Marshall 100-watt 30th anniversary heads in stereo with two 4x12s with 25-watt greenbacks in them. And let's just say in stereo, it was a mighty big sound. And he really liked that sound because he had actually played guitar on two of Fish's records prior to that and actually produced one. And the last album he had played on was called Rain Gods with Zippo. And there I was at that show playing a lot of the parts that Steven had played, and he really liked it. And we really talked and became kind of close. And we kept in touch over the next few years. And so when they got the deal to make their first record for Lava Atlantic, they had made the record. He'd recorded the tracks to Blackest Eyes. I think on that opening track, he'd used a Les Paul or a PRS and some a 5150 amp. But anyway, he got into mixing it, and he wasn't happy with the heaviness of the track. And he had remembered how big those two Marshalls had sounded with this Les Paul. And actually, this rat pedal right there. So anyway, he called me up and asked me if he'd send me the Pro Tools files, could I try and heavy up the track? And I love the band, so I was like, yeah, send that stuff over. And he sent it over, and me and Mark Prater got into our little Pro Tools studio, and I whipped out this Les Paul and this rat and a 30th anniversary head. Now this is an old Super Lead 120 that's been modded, but similar to the 30th anniversary I had at the time. We sat there and recorded track after track after track, take after take of the riffs, the heavy riffs within the song Blackest Eyes. Packaged them all up, sent them over to him, and he loved them and was able to mix them in. And then he asked me if I would sing on some stuff, and then I provided some background vocals for a few songs, and then eventually we went into talks. And I joined the band as the sideman, guitarist, vocalist, and spent the next 8 years in Porcupine Tree. And then I was able to work on and off a couple of years after that with him on his solo projects. So this guitar kind of opened the door to that thing on that song, Blackest Eyes. And it was a vicious sound. I mean, you can hear it even to this day. You know. Les Paul, Rat, Marshall, what do you want? Now imagine that stacked with Steven's parts on his ripping 5150 that he was using at the time, and mixing all that together, and it was a mighty big sound. And that song blew the doors open for not only Porcupine Tree, but for me. It really opened the doors to the rest of my career. So that was great. It was done on this guitar. This is the Blackest Eyes Les Paul. It was a late 80s 60 reissue. They were starting to do some 60s reissues. So it's got that nice kind of Joe Walshy 60 kind of neck and super heavy body. And, the stock Gibson pickups. Now, I actually put a Fishman bridge in here because when I was working with Fish, I was actually running a stereo input in. It wasn't stereo. It was two outputs. And one side was piezo and one side was magnetic. So even then, before I got into Porcupine Tree, and it's one of the things that helped when I got into Porcupine Tree right away, I was playing this guitar with the piezo split. And on the song Blackest Eyes live, I would go back and forth with a clean sound piezo mix to the super heavy. And I had a GCX switching system at the time that would switch those back and forth. Now, shortly after that, I moved into the Gig Rig MIDI 8 and then the Gig Rig Evolutions. And here I am on the Gig Rig Atom today. So this was the guitar that opened a lot of doors for me, and it's a cool thing, the Blackest Eyes guitar. But the story isn't really the Blackest Eyes guitar. The story is where the guitar came from. Now, at that point in my life, that was probably late 2001 when I was cutting those tracks, maybe early 2002. It's kind of vague. Um, I had had this guitar since the 90s, late 90s. And the way it came into my life was I was a single dad, struggling musician. I'd just done another record. It was an independent record, so it was doing what independent records do. And it was getting me some things and opening some doors. And I was just about to get the offer to play as a sideman for that Scottish artist Fish. And I had never done that before. And I was kind of struggling. I was raising a daughter on my own. We were living in some crappy apartment and I could barely make rent. And I was gigging. And I was doing this one particular gig on Friday afternoons in downtown Tampa on kind of the business street. And it's still that way. It's a street called Franklin. And so I was sitting on the corner of Franklin in a little area where they would have a bunch of restaurants, and the city would pay me to sit there on Friday afternoons and play from noon to 1:30. And an old friend of mine walked up, and his name is Joe Riley. And now Joe and I go way back. Him and me and a guy named John Parrott. We all met probably when I was getting out of high school and I was teaching John guitar lessons. And in and out of my life, Joe and John would wander into gigs and out of gigs, and I would see them from time to time. And I hadn't seen Joe in a while, and he wanders up, "Hey man, you sound pretty good." And I'm like, "Joe, God, where you been? It's been forever." And we start talking about things and music and stuff like that. And he goes, "Hey, do you have a Les Paul?" I was like, "No, I don't have a Les Paul." At that point, I only had two electrics. I had my PRS CE and I had a Strat. And he said, "I've got a Les Paul under my bed." And I'm like, "What? You have a Les Paul under your bed?" And he goes, "Yeah. I've had it under there for about 10 years. I have an Explorer I play. I really like my Explorer. I never really got along with a Les Paul, so I just kind of stuck it under my bed." I'm like, "Joe Riley, you have a Les Paul under your bed." And he said, "Yeah, you want it?" And I was just like, I was like, "Man, I can't afford a Les Paul. I can't afford to barely feed my daughter and pay rent at the time, much less buy a Les Paul from you." He goes, "No, man, I'll give it to you." He goes, "You're working hard, you're doing things. I'll help you out." And I was like, "Okay, sure." I mean, look, I love Joe and all that kind of stuff, but man, people have made me promises my whole life, and very few times in my life had anyone just walk up and handed me a guitar. Now it had happened, but that's a whole nother story. But no one had ever walked up and handed me a Les Paul. So sure enough, next Friday, I'm out on that corner and there's Joe Riley. I see him walking down the street and he's carrying this old Les Paul case. And it wasn't that old. It was about 10, 12 years old at that point, but it had been under a bed. So it wasn't in the greatest shape. And he walks up and I take a break and he opens the case and it's this. I mean, look at this thing. It's got this flame. It's just gorgeous red. It's that classic thing. Now, it hadn't been played in so long. The frets had a coating of kind of decay on it, and you can actually you really can't see it, but even on the back here, it had started to kind of decay, and so the frets hadn't been touched in so long you could barely move the strings on the frets. But it was great. I picked it up and put it in my hand, and it's got that classic 60s neck feel, which I love because I had fallen in love with a Les Paul earlier than that, let's say 1993, and that's another story that's going to come out. But I didn't have that Les Paul, and that Les Paul was gone. And here was Joe standing with this Les Paul, and he says, "Here, man, you take it." And I'm like, "Well, what do I owe you for it?" And he goes, "Maybe I'll come back and get it someday, maybe not." And Joe left me with that Les Paul. And I took it home and I polished the frets out and I tweaked the neck and I put new strings on it and I plugged it into my Marshall and my Rat. And it was glorious. And so that guitar served me all through the Fish years. And it took a beating in the Fish year. There's some times it fell off the stage, got guitar stands got kicked over and then when the opportunity to track those parts for Steven and the Porcupine Tree came up, there was the Joe Riley Les Paul. And I never forgot that. And I toured this Les Paul for many years in Porcupine Tree. And eventually I was able to build a relationship with PRS, and I started touring mostly PRSs. But this one came along with me for many years because with Porcupine Tree, you needed a lot of guitars. So, and it has been with me ever since. And that was a long time ago. And I love this Les Paul, and I will forever be indebted to and grateful to the good-heartedness of Joe Riley. Now, we saw each other recently. Our friend John, who used to come to all the shows, but we lost him a couple years ago. And that's another guitar story that we're gonna talk about. This is the second guitar story. The first one was about my little black PRS CE. This one is about what will be titled the Blackest Eyes Les Paul, but in reality, it is the Joe Riley Les Paul. This is the Journeyman Guitarist. I hope you enjoyed this guitar story about the Blackest Eyes Les Paul, the story of the riff, the story of my entry into that amazing band, all provided by and enabled by my good friend Joe Riley, the Journeyman Guitarist. Subscribe, like, recommend it to your friends, buy me a cup of coffee. And I hope you enjoyed this, and we'll catch you next time. The Journeyman Guitarist, out.